Welcome to Imposter Hour with Liz and Greg. Join us as we explore self-doubt, imposter characters, and even real-life con artists. We appreciate you spending your time with us today.
Welcome. We are thrilled to have Gare Billings on the show today. He resides in upstate New York and is the proud doodle dad to a mini golden doodle named Murphy, who is also on the show today. During the day, Gare works as an onboarding specialist, and at night he indulges his passion for thrillers as an armchair detective. Gare has been part of the Bookstagram community since 2017 under the handle at Gare Indeed Reads, which has introduced him to an amazing network of authors, friends, and publishers, as well as provided numerous bookish opportunities. Combined with his love of books and movies, he's the guy who loves to create a Hollywood cast as part of the review process for his favorite books. Growing up, he loved thriller and horror movies and could not get enough of the Goosebumps and Fear Street books, and the Scholastic Book Fair was his second Christmas. Now, as a blogger, he gets the same enjoyment when a nice pile of book mail comes through the door. Currently, he also works as a contributor for She Reads. Welcome, Gare.
Hey, thanks for having me. I'm so excited to be
Thank you for
here.
coming on.
Wow.
I just want to give a little bit of color commentary for our listeners as well who may not know. Gare was when Liz and I were we fledgling authors finding our way blindly in this big vast world of publishing. Gare was one of our first real champions, one of the first people who reached out and was really accommodating and was enthusiastic about stuff. We became fast friends. We were able to meet him at one of our book events early on. And he's just been amazingly supportive, a wonderful friend. We have a blast every time we kind of, have any kind of back and forth or, DMs or whatever it is. So it's fun to, have an excuse to just have you on to talk books. And you are also just a wonderful champion for the book community, for the Bookstagram community, for authors, for everyone involved in this crazy world. So great to have you on that.
Wow. Okay, well, let's wrap it up. That was amazing. That's all we needed to hear. Well, thank you so much for that. Anyone else probably would have blocked me when I was blowing up their Instagram on I believe it was Christmas Eve, to tell you everything about the book, page by page review. So I'm happy that you guys stuck around with me after all of that.
I mean, that was just another Christmas gift.
Right.
For me, I was like, that is still my favorite ending to any book I've ever read.
That is high praise because you are a well-read man.
Yes, yeah.
I am still chasing that high.
Okay. Nice.
Us too.
Yeah.
Well, Gare, I realize that we have been so lucky to have, all of your encouragement and praise for our books and for so many other books. I mean, I think my TBR list is mostly comprised of books that you recommend. But when I was kind of putting together your bio, I realized we don't know a lot about you, like the man behind the Bookstagram.
Yeah.
And this is a really great opportunity because you were willing to come on. We assume you can relate to the concept of imposter syndrome. And that's not necessarily something I would have assumed about you. So why don't we just start there? Where does imposter syndrome show up in your life?
I have been thinking about this a lot, and I did not realize until I had a discussion with you guys about coming on that imposter syndrome has really hit me in almost every aspect of my life. So for work, my relationships with my friends, romantic relationships, hobbies and interests, I feel like it's all kind of hit me at some point in my life. But for career wise, I think that was the first time I was really hit with imposter syndrome. In my teens, in my early 20s, I worked retail through college, and then I got my job that I currently have now. And it was the first office job that I had. It was the first thing that wasn't just folding t-shirts and getting paid to be friendly. So it was such a different world for me. And there was so much for me to learn and adapt to compared to people that had kind of been in that field for a while, that I was like, I don't know if this is for me. I don't know if this is something that I was meant to do. I don't know if I'm smart enough or if I have the experience enough to do this. And, now it's 12 years later and, I have a son to feed. So I have to kind of go through and do it. But now it's kind of like it comes like second nature. I can do my job in my sleep. But, that first, I would say probably year and a half, I was like, who am I? I'm not built for this.
Hmm.
So that was kind of a very strong awakening for
Okay.
me.
Yeah. I think that's a really relatable feeling in that, realm in the office, because I think we all
Yeah,
have kind of multiple identities in that world in a way that maybe other settings. I mean, retail, sure. There's also, you kind of have to put it on, and
right.
working in like the food service industry, but there's so many like political personality, like machinations going on in an office that
Yeah.
my experience, even when I'd worked in an industry for over 2 decades, I still would have imposter syndrome depending on the day or the scenario. So I really relate to that.
Mhm.
Now,
Yeah.
with
Yeah. It's kind of like, I don't know. I think it kind of clicked with me when, like, my job is just on the phone so much. I work as an HR, like, onboarding specialist. So I'm on the phone trying to get people to fill out a background check and do a drug test and, you know, do all of these things. But we work countrywide. So, like, everything is on the phone. I can't meet somebody in person, basically. And at one point, my boss was like, your skills in customer service from working, retail your whole life is kind of what honed you in on like having this be your like special area of interest basically. So that's kind of when that like disappeared, but at first it was wild, it's
Yeah,
crazy.
life, and I think work, career, however you look at it, can be interesting in that way sometimes. Where sometimes you almost accidentally fall into something and realize that you have this other skill set that you had never realized you had that actually applies to the thing you're doing. It's like we sort of weirdly side door our ways into various things in that way, and then suddenly it just turns out you kind of have half an idea of what you might be doing in this thing. You know,
yeah,
interesting.
Yeah, I wish that I would have like had a little bit more knowledge of
Right.
myself instead of focusing so much on that
Yeah.
job, because then I would have been like, oh, this is why I'm
Right.
here,
hmm.
but it took a year and a half and somebody else to tell me. So then I was like, oh, so that's what this is.
Well, I mean, we're rarely our own most objective critics, right? It's like so often that
Yeah.
I say this with Liz. We've known each other for a long time. We're writing partners. It's amazing sometimes how someone who has just enough distance from you can have a much more objective kind of take on what you're up to, who you are, what problem you keep butting your head up against. It's pretty sobering.
Right.
So,
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, Garrett, walk us through how you went, so you worked in retail and then you went to this job that you've been in for some years. At what point did you realize, I love books, I'm a reader, I have a lot to say about books, I'm going to take to Bookstagram?
This was like a wild ride because I've always been a big reader, but I had to be very picky with what I read, and I don't want that to come off snobby, but I had to be picky in the sense of I didn't have a lot of time. I
Mhm.
didn't have a lot of time. I didn't make a lot of time to read. So it had to be something that everybody was buzzing about
Mhm.
for me to pick it up, because I was like, if I'm going to read a book, I want it to be something I'm interested in. I want it to be good. And I think that life was a little wild in my
mhm,
20s, and I kind of fell off from reading until Gone Girl
mhm,
came out. And when Gone Girl came out, everybody was talking about it, and they were like, you're never going to believe the ending to this book. And Gillian Flynn had 3 books out, and I was like, ooh, I don't want to risk it. I don't want to be that person that reads Gone Girl and have the ending be completely lost on me if it's somehow connected to another one of these books.
Mhm.
So I was like binging her first 2 books as quickly as possible and completely fell in
mhm.
love with her
Mhm.
and the way that she tells a story and all of it, so I could get to Gone Girl and realize that I didn't have to read the first 2. Um, but then after that, it was kind of like what we were discussing earlier. Like I was chasing that high, and I would just dedicate every Sunday to reading.
Hmm.
So like on Instagram with social media and everything, every Sunday I would put, a book that I had bought myself or that I was reading. And one of my friends actually said, there's a whole community of people that do this every single day, not
Mhm.
just Sundays. And it's not just like, here's what I'm reading. Like they'll talk about it, they'll write reviews. And she's like, and it's like fun photography. And I think you would do really well with this.
Hmm.
And it was like January, upstate New
Mhm.
York. Christmas is over. I'm bored out of my mind. I'm snowed in. And I was like, screw it. I'm just going to do it. Like, I just kind of came up with a handle and I posted my first picture, started following people. And then, like, there was this weird euphoric state for like about 6 months of creating all of these friends, having authors like follow me on Instagram, thank me for my review, and all of this stuff. And I'm like, this is such a weird experience for me because Beyonce and Rihanna are not calling me to say, like, I'm glad you love
Right,
my
right.
album, you know? And like, Sarah Michelle Gellar is not calling me and being like, I'm glad you're watching Buffy for the 100th time in your life. So it was just kind of like, wow, like it just felt so cool, but it also felt like doing something that was hard work that I enjoyed was like paying off by building those
Yeah,
connections.
yeah.
Mhm.
So you had something.
And then I started getting free
Yeah.
books too. And I was like, wow, look at all the money I'm saving.
Economic and for readers as well. Um, are you? No, I got to ask you about this because it's sort of your trademark, and I think it's such a brilliant concept that you brought
Yeah.
into the Bookstagram space. So for our listeners who aren't familiar with Garrett stuff, um, you do these amazing virtual castings for the books, and I wonder. I mean, I assume as being a young avid reader and also a big film buff, these sort of dovetailed very naturally. But what was that process for you of kind of coming up with that concept and building that out?
I I have a horrible
Okay.
memory. So basically what would happen is I would read a book and they would say like, this is Sarah and she's tall and blonde, and I'd be like, okay, so I'd make a note and say Sarah's like Blake Lively,
Hmm.
and then here's Tom and he's like the sexiest man alive, and I'd be like, okay, so like this is Henry Cavill, and I would just keep notes so that at the end of the book when it's like the killer's Henry, I'd be like, who the
Right.
hell's Henry? So I just kind of like would do that so I could remember all of the characters, and I felt like it built like a big picture
Mhm.
for me. And when I first started, they had announced Big Little Lies was going to be a TV show. And it was like Reese Witherspoon and Nicole Kidman were attached, but you didn't know who was playing who. So when I read the book, I completely got it wrong. And I was thinking to myself, like, I wonder who's going to play these different people because I could see Nicole and Reese playing different characters. So I entered this like 30-day photo challenge where you had to pick a different book for each day. And my first one was Big Little
Okay.
Lies. And then every book that I did, I would pick a different character and I would kind of like fan
Mhm.
cast them. And I didn't win the challenge, but I got a lot of people who were like, oh, this is actually kind of really cool. So then I still did those notes when I was reading after joining Bookstagram, and I just started making collages. And I thought it was like a really fun idea to like kind of talk to other people, see if I ever got it right when the book did become a movie. And then it just kind of took off. Like now I can't read anything without somebody being like, who's your who's your cast for this?
Right.
So it just kind of like took off on its own.
That's good.
Well, and it's so great because I think that a lot of people, when they read books, they imagine different, celebrities or, recognizable figures as the characters, whether they're keeping them straight in their head or it's just like who kind of comes to them.
Yeah.
And I think for other readers to see how that like squares up with what you've picked is really cool. But I think even more so for authors to see what you choose, because I think in our minds, at least in mine, I usually have someone's face, body, like in my mind. It's not usually a celebrity. So, it's like whatever my creative brain is cooking up. So it was so wonderful when you cast the woman inside, because it's like I didn't even think about those people for our detectives. Like it just opened up the connection in my brain about how much readers have like an individual experience when they read. And that's what I love about reading so much. Like we could all read the same book and have a completely different experience. We can
Oh,
all,
100%.
and obviously it's subjective. Someone could love it, someone could hate it, but how you actually picture the characters or experience the story itself. And that's what I think your casting is really done. Like when you recommend something, I always take your recommendations, but when you cast it, I'm like, oh, cool. Like that makes me want to read it more.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And I always like to do the like, I call it the Drew Barrymore effect, where there's like a huge star that like plays somebody who may not be on screen for that long or plays like a really important role, but like isn't very like present throughout the entire book. But it's been like really fun to play with because I really have only had one bad experience with a casting, and it wasn't anything too crazy. It was just I casted Channing Tatum as a serial killer, and people were like not happy with me because it was like the gorgeous all-American guy next door that you would never suspect as a serial killer. And I was like, well, who would suspect Channing Tatum? And he's like the epitome of that. And people were like, I cannot believe you did that. Like, I didn't actually turn him into a serial killer.
Right.
I just thought I would trick you, and everyone got pissed.
Well, that's the power. That's the power, though, of casting and of that sort of medium. Is like you hear these stories, with actors who get stopped, who play like a bad guy on a series, right, playing an antagonist. They get stopped in the street. People are like actually mad at them, as if they're the person on screen, as if they're the character, come to life, and they're out like wreaking havoc in public. It's such a wild connection that readers and viewers have with characters.
Right.
It's so funny. Like I feel like it's like almost like trying to trick people because I've been tricked. Like I went to see the movie Scream because of Drew Barrymore. And I went to go see I Know What You Did Last Summer and Scream 2 because of Sarah Michelle Gellar. And so I was like, what is going on? Like, why does this keep happening to me? So now it's kind of like fun to like play with that a little bit and try to avoid typecasting because I think one of my biggest like inspirations is the fact that Jamie Dornan played this horrifying serial killer in the show The Fall, and then he went to like the sexiest man alive in like 50 Shades of Grey. And the fact that he like went from like directly from one to the other is like just proves that like even if someone's typecast, they can always like change it at a later time and completely wow you.
Oh yeah, the range is amazing. The other thing that always occurs to me when I'm going through and kind of checking out your casting is you also, because it's a virtual cast, you also have the luxury of unlimited budgets. So you can Drew Barrymore the whole cast. Like you can cameo, you can like get anyone who you want for, a 5-minute cameo. You can get for like sort of like B and C character arcs and smaller stuff. And it's like you kind of have, so it's great because it's like you can really just do an all-star team for every casting project. It's amazing.
Yeah, it's fun, but there are like times where I try to like find someone's headshot and I can't find it because I think that like sometimes when you watch something, there's always that one person who like you don't expect to be the best performance, but like somebody like sneaks up on you in like a supporting role. And so when I see that, I just want to like highlight that person everywhere, but yeah, it's been kind of fun to like, I guess, trick people, and it's been fun to like build a different cast because in my mind I can see people that I think would perform really well together or have before and kind of like reunite them. So it's been like really fun to do that.
I look forward to it every week, so please never stop.
Oh, thank you. I won't.
So I wanted to ask, because in your bio, which I pulled a little bit from some stuff I found on the internet, because I just really related so heavily to the Scholastic Book Fair and being drawn to Goosebumps and, Fear Street and like that. It sounds like we were all reading the kind of precursors to thrillers, mysteries, horror, like when we were young. And
Yeah.
and I know that you've kind of moved a little bit in the genres you read, and I want to talk about that eventually too. But like, I know you really as a thriller reader, and it seems like you've been reading thrillers. And then from what you've mentioned, Buffy, Scream, I know what you did last summer. You're a horror fan as well. So
Yes.
do you want to talk a little bit about like the origins of that leaning and what you love about those genres?
Oh, 100%. We talk about that all day. Um, I felt like Goosebumps was really popular. And the thing that I enjoyed about it is that there were books, but there was also a TV show when I was younger. So that was fun to read the book and then see the episode that the book was based on and see the difference between what I kind of imagined in my mind and how it played out. And then Fear Street, where they were like a little bit more teen-ish and not as like, you know, far-fetched. Those got me really into it because I felt like a lot of those were like whodunits,
Mm-hmm.
and there was always some sort of wild twist at the end. And that's what I looked forward to the most. It was like the creepy setting, and it wasn't too far-fetched, but there were also like all of these wild twists. Um, and I just got so invested in them that I couldn't stop. And obviously my parents were like, you're not out being a little heathen, so like we're just going to keep buying you books. And then there's a series by R.L. Stine called The Babysitter,
Mm-hmm.
and I think there's like 4 books. And when I read them, each one had such a brilliant twist, but it follows one girl throughout the whole series and these different like scenarios that she gets herself in. And I was like, I want to find a movie like that. I wish I could find a movie or a show like it. And then eventually Scream came out. And I wanted to go see Scream because I loved Drew Barrymore, like from E.T., Drew Barrymore. And I was like, Drew Barrymore's in it. Like, she's the little girl from E.T. How bad can it be? And then when I went, I was like devastated, obviously, with the first 10 minutes of the movie. But I kept watching. I got my money's worth. I finished my popcorn and I ended up loving it. And then they kept coming out and they kept following Nev Campbell's character. And I was like, I think I finally found it. Like, I found the thing that I want to see. I guess like even at a young age, it was very interesting for me to watch a fictional character go through that trauma
Mm-hmm.
and how their life changed with each, installment.
Mm-hmm.
So then I got kind of addicted to the whodunit aspect
Mm-hmm.
and who's going to survive. And then as time went on, it wasn't so much about who did it, but like I also got very interested in motives as well.
Mm-hmm.
And then I started to read, and now I'm just kind of in this place where I'm trying to find the person that doesn't allow me to guess the ending. And I've been really lucky with that.
Mm-hmm.
You're talking, a good bit about your kind of formative reading years and how that shaped you. And you mentioned earlier that there's you feel like you have a lot of imposter syndrome in various aspects of your life and various kind of fields and things like that. And I was wondering, is the reading experience for you, does that help to kind of offset or quell any of that anxiety around those feelings? Is that something that maybe has drawn you in?
It's helped me a little bit because I think the thing with imposter syndrome for me that I've experienced with being a reader is sometimes my reviews might not be as long or, might not have the same wording as other people. And I'm just kind of like, I can say how much I loved a book and what I loved about it. But, at the end of the day, some people really find enjoyment in writing like a 5-page review. And so I had gotten to the point where I was like, am I not as good of a book reviewer if I'm not writing the same kind of reviews that other people are writing, or if my captions aren't as lengthy?
Mm-hmm.
And so there was there was like a little bit of hesitation with that. Um, but the thing that actually helped me with that were like a lot of the people that were like, I love the books that you
Mm.
recommend. So that's kind of what helped me, was like my reviews might not be like award winning, they might not be like up to par with other people's, but people do seem to like my taste
Mm-hmm.
in books. So that's kind of helped
Yeah.
with that.
Well, that's, I mean, that's, that's the golden ticket. People can't buy taste, you know? So, because you're a valuable commodity, my friend.
I have good taste in books and nothing else.
Well, being specialized is, there's something to be said for that as well.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I'm just thinking, with the Bookstagram community, there's, so many wonderful reviewers, content creators, um, and that's relatively new, like in the last, decade, right? But with the rise of Bookstagram, it came really after the shrinking of traditional book review sections. So, I think that in addition to like providing a service to readers, like discoverability, like finding out what new books are from Bookstagrammers, there's also this like amazing community that's grown. You can kind of connect, Bookstagrammers that work together, or,
Yeah.
collaborate. And that's not necessarily something that you would see with the traditional book review coverage, of the past. It was kind of elitist, and, they would review books that they would like slaughter. Not all book reviews were
Yeah.
favorable. And I know, and I think there is a place for that. But one of the things I love as a reader and a writer about Bookstagram is I think that there's a lot of just love for writing and books and genres, and connecting with other fans, that
Mhm.
wasn't possible with kind of the old traditional media. And I'm just wondering how you experience like being on the other side of that. Is there competitiveness amongst bookstagrammers? Is there like, oh, everyone's reviewing that book, so I don't want to do it? Like, how does that kind of curation process work?
I think the thing that's competitive that I find very interesting is when people post that they received an advance copy of a book,
Mm-hmm.
they post their stack of book mail. I feel like it gets a little competitive when other people are like, oh, I haven't gotten
Mhm.
that yet.
Mm-hmm.
I haven't, like, why didn't I get my copy yet? I'll have to reach out. And so that's always been kind of interesting to me. When I see it, it's kind of like, oh, so I know that the arcs are available now, so I can reach out, or maybe there'll be one in my mailbox when I get done work today. But I feel like there is like a little competitiveness with that aspect of who gets it first.
Mm-hmm.
If they get like a big title, like if Gillian Flynn ever writes another book, we're gonna have the Hunger Games with bookstagrammers when it comes to like getting like advanced
Right.
review copies, and I will win. But but I feel like there's like a situation with that, and I also kind of feel like I've noticed when somebody gets really popular as an author, they have like this very high peak where their books are all over the place, and then people start to hate on them just for being popular.
Mm-hmm.
So like Colleen Hoover, I've
Mhm.
noticed it with, and Frida McFadden.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And it's just kind of like people have been raving about their books for a long time, but now that they're getting popular, like you're going to hate on them when it's something that they wrote years and years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And so I try not to like, I try to stay away from that unless there's something that somebody is talking about that might have a trigger warning or maybe problematic. But other than that, like I love Colleen Hoover and I love Frida
Mhm.
McFadden, and I will forever not let those people's opinions and the haters
Mm-hmm.
get in my mind. But I just think that it is kind of sad to see when it happens to somebody because,
Mm-hmm.
you know, somebody like that, their next book could be their best book. but if people are going to be trashing you on the internet for being popular, how many people are going to know it? You know, so that's the only thing that's kind of like a disadvantage, I think, with Bookstagram.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I don't mind negative reviews. I just, I've always wanted to curate my page as almost like a digital scrapbook of everything that I've read and loved
Mm-hmm.
and all of those good memories that I've had while reading something. So like I personally don't post good review or bad reviews. I only keep it like positive in mine.
Mm-hmm.
Um, if I ever write a book someday and I saw a negative review, like it would kind of like, I know it would break my heart. So I just kind of like stick to posting what I love and keep it going from
Nice.
there.
And we've noticed Liz mentioned a little bit earlier in the conversation that you've expanded a little bit kind of in your reading material as well. And I've noticed as well that
Mm-hmm.
you've moved, it seems like a bit more into romance recently as well. How did that kind of come about, that swing or whatever come about?
I did. I don't, there was a book when I was 13 or 14, and it's called The Density of Souls by Christopher Rice. And it's my favorite book in the entire world. And when I read it, it was the first story that I felt like had queer representation.
Mm-hmm.
And I couldn't find anything else after it. Like it was like the worst book hangover I've ever had. And so then I got into, you know, I stayed with my thrillers and whatnot, and I would continue to read everything that Christopher Rice released after. And then he kind of switched it up, and Christopher Rice started writing under C. Travis Rice. And he was like, you know, I'm writing romance, and I know that you are probably going to be like, oh, I'm never going to read romance. But he's like, I'm writing it. I really, you know, want to see what you think. And I read it, and I really, really enjoyed it. And then it kind of brought me back to the fact that I grew up, you know, from my teens to my 20s and even a little bit into my 30s. There weren't a lot of stories with queer characters, you know, like
Mm-hmm.
my friends could read The Babysitter's Club and they could like see, you know, a girl and a boy fall in love, but there wasn't anything like that for me. So I felt like once I started reading those stories, I got into romance because I was making up for lost time,
Mm-hmm.
if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And I feel like with romance, there's a lot of similarities with like thrillers.
I wanted to ask you about
Like
that. Yeah, I don't read a lot of romance, but I'm curious if there are through lines.
I feel like with romance, it's like, are they going to end up
Right.
together? And if so, how? How is it going to happen? There's so many different tropes as well. So like enemies to lovers I find very interesting because you start page one and they're like, I hate this person with every ounce of my being. And then in the end there's the happily ever after. So even when I know that they're going to end up together and have that happily ever after, it still is very interesting to me to see how they get there.
Mm.
And do you feel
So it's they're
But
either
I
going
do
to
like
end
to
up
switch it
together
up.
or they're going to murder each other, depending on which genre you're reading.
I actually found one. There's it's called Dysfunctional by Isabel Lucero, and it's about a serial killer who is stalking a man who he believes is another serial killer. And he's like trying to catch him in the act, and they end up like falling for each
nice?
other.
Oh, wow.
And I was like, this is perfect.
That checks every box on your wish list.
I know. I was like, there's so many red flags. I'm at the circus.
That's
I'm
right.
obsessed.
To that point, do you feel like there is more meaningful queer representation in fiction these days? I mean, it seems like it is, but you're, you know, being a reader of a lot of it yourself, do you feel like it's more representative?
Yeah, yeah, I do. I do. I feel like there's a lot more. So, I mean, there's always room for improvement, right? I mean, with everything,
Right.
Mm-hmm.
especially in publishing. But I do think that there are more because now there's not as many thrillers, I would say, but there is a lot of like queer romance that I find very interesting that is written by queer authors as well as a lot of women who write fantastic queer romance. Um, there's a lot of literary fiction that I've been kind of getting into that are, you know, queer stories. Um, I'm gonna murder his last name, but Andres N. Orderica, I believe is how you pronounce his last name. He wrote a book called How We Name the Stars, and I finished it, and through the book, I sobbed for like 20 minutes straight, and I've never had that reaction before. So I'm happy that there's a lot more queer representation in publishing now.
That's good to hear. Well, I want to just go back to something you said about following Christopher Rice from, that first book into a pen name and another genre. One of the things that I've really admired in the way you read and review is you have this author loyalty. So you find an author you like and you read, their catalog. I've seen it with Karen Slaughter. I've seen it with a number of different, contemporary thriller writers. It sounds like with romance as well. And I think that's wonderful because I don't know that that's such a regular practice. It seems like a lot of people want to consume and they want, a certain type of book, but not necessarily like, I want to read everything by this author. So is that kind of your practice now? Do you find one author you like and read everything they've done? Like, how do you decide?
I would say if somebody blows my socks off and I'm like, oh my God, I love this, I can't get enough, I'm going to read their entire catalog. And, or if there's something that's really special in a book that sticks with me, like I said, I have a really bad memory. So if there's something with me that's sticking with a book like a year, 2 years, 3 years after, I'm gonna want to read that person's backlist when they're like a 5-star book review.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Karen Slaughter, Karen Slaughter was a wild reading experience because she has 2 series that are connected. And so I just started reading one and I was like, maybe I'll get into this. And I had read some of her standalones and I had one that I absolutely loved. I had one that I really liked. And then I had one that I was like, I don't think this was for me. Then I got into her series and I was like, oh no, this is exactly where I should be. And the same thing with Jennifer Hillier.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Jar of Hearts is one of my favorite books in the entire world. And when we first entered lockdown, one of the first things I did was I ordered all of her books off Amazon. And I paid like a ridiculous amount for this like special edition Canadian paperback of like Wonderland. But I was like, I need to have all of them. And I just binged her entire catalog, like right when lockdown started. And it was just one of my favorite experiences.
Well, you actually,
and no,
I was just going to say, you actually were also my gateway to Jennifer Hillier because you were so nice to feature The Woman Inside a couple times with some roundups with Jar of Hearts. So I thought like, okay, well now I got to jump. I knew her name, hadn't read her, realized I had to jump in basically off of your say so, and now have read. I think her almost her whole catalog at this point. So that you were the gateway on that one, for sure.
She's amazing, and she does one of the things that I love, where her books are standalones, but they'll reference other things from other books. And I'm just like, that's such a nice little treat as like a reader and somebody who's like a fan of her. So I really like when people do
those
that.
Easter eggs are a lot of fun.
As you guys know.
Yes.
Of course.
Justice for Sheila.
Well, I will just say I'll tease you with this little setup right here. The book that comes out in January, our next one. There are a number of Easter eggs, but there are 2 specifically that you will appreciate. So I just want to lay that out now. And I have sort of a corollary question to what Liz asked last, but I'm always curious. Like I feel like as a writer, I mean as a reader, but also as a writer, I'm always picking up books. Occasionally we get asked to blurb a book, but it's a lot of stuff that I'm just sort of picking up, or like I'm hearing stuff, on other people's recommendations and things like that. As someone who's getting sent books consistently by publishers and things like that, let's say you have a scenario where you end up with a book stack and you don't have one of your kind of go-to like dependable authors maybe in that stack. If let's say it's a collection of maybe some debut authors or some authors you haven't yet read. do you have any kind of dependable kind of method for how you're gonna, kind of pick what you read next, or is it sort of a crapshoot? What's your method?
I used to be really good at reading things the month before they
Okay.
came out so that my review could be out like around when it was
Okay.
published. And I had some like health issues, so I got like a little behind on it. I took like a little break. And so now I pretty much have always stuck to um trying to read things in like pub date
Yeah.
order. I keep a list of everything I get on my phone, but there are some things that like I'll keep it in mind for like publishing order, but then like if I get a Jennifer Hillier, if I get a Karen Slaughter, if I get a book by you guys, I write Saturday next to it because I'm like, these people are not going to let me sleep. Like this is not something that I start on a Monday night to prepare for my work week. Like there are certain things that I have to read on the weekend so that I can devote more of my time to it. But other than that, it's usually by
Yeah.
pub date. Um, or if there's something that like there's some I would say like a
Mhm.
sleeper hit
Mhm.
where not a lot of people are anticipating the book, but when it comes out and more people read it, like everybody's like, "Oh my God, you
Yeah.
have to read this.
Mhm.
You know, like this needs to be on your
Yeah.
TBR." And those will probably take precedence too. You know, like once I get my hands on it, I'm like, "All right, time to see what everyone's talking about."
Well, obviously, one of the things we love to talk about on the show is imposters and imposter characters. And, we couldn't think
Mhm.
of someone who's probably more well read on imposter characters than you that we know personally. So I'm just curious, what are some of your favorite kind of legendary imposter characters, like with great twists, people you didn't expect? I mean, there's so much on that spectrum, but who comes to mind?
I mean, I think all of my favorites, you could pretty much say that character's dealt with imposter syndrome at some point. Um, I think in a good thriller, you can kind of pick out imposter syndrome within most of your key
Mhm.
characters. Geo in Jar of
Yeah.
Hearts.
Sure.
Mhm.
Pretty much every character in The Woman Inside, I think that I could. I mean, like, listen, like, if I were back in college, this could be like what I write my
The
like
dissertation.
final papers on. Like, my dissertation would be The Woman Inside and like everything that I love about it. But I think that was one of the ones actually that had me hooked on imposter
Yeah.
syndrome because I think the thing that's very interesting, you guys mentioned this in a previous episode about imposter syndrome and con artists. And I think that there's been a huge misconception when it comes to a book that features a con artist because people think of like somebody like Carmen Sandiego, like running around like Paris trying to steal art or something. But like the emotional, manipulative con artists that are in books, I find to be completely fascinating. Um, Rachel from Girl
Oh
on the
yeah.
Train,
Mhm.
incredible. Nick and Amy from Gone Girl, you
Mhm.
know, like I think the thing that I find fascinating, which is why I'm so happy you guys started this podcast, is I think with imposter syndrome, it can be taught, it can be natural, or it can be like it can stem from like any sort of abuse,
Mhm.
like narcissistic
Sure.
abuse.
Mhm.
And so I feel like there are so many ways you can play with that in a psychological
Right.
thriller.
Mhm.
And I think that's why I love the characters that you guys write specifically, because you have so many different directions you can take your characters when it comes to a psychological
Mhm.
thriller that everything seems very revolutionary and none of it gets stale. There's nothing really repeated. And I think it's like very fascinating that you can kind of pick out imposter syndrome in any character in a thriller
Mhm.
if you really put your mind
Right.
to it.
Yeah. I mean,
I love that
yeah,
take.
you make a really interesting point about, I hadn't really framed it that way, but the results or the roots, I guess I should say, of imposter syndrome, of that sort of like the narcissistic abuse and of the learned behavior and all that kind of stuff. And I know from an author perspective of writing that, there's something very cathartic as a reader as well, I guess. But as a writer, there's something very cathartic about being able to kind of work some of that stuff out on the page. And I wonder for you, like as a reader, do you find that as well? Is there a kind of a catharsis or just a, I don't know.
Oh my God, it's so satisfying. It's so sad. Like, I feel like the thing is that's really interesting to me is when you take some of these personal relationships that people have had and you think back, like, there are so many men I would have loved to pull a Gone Girl on. There are so many, but I didn't have the time, I didn't have the resources, and I didn't want to end up in prison. So I just think that like when you experience things like that and you whether you take the high road or you get revenge in some sort of way, it's just so satisfying to see other people that are in a position like that who can kind of do things that you're like, I thought of that too. You know, like I dreamed of that a little bit. Because the thing that like I find super fascinating, and I think you explore this a little bit in The Woman Inside, which I'm gonna talk about every day of my life at this point. But I feel like there are certain games that people play when they date,
Mhm.
and it's like, you know, there's memes about it. Like, don't show him you're crazy until you're like a year in, or like, you know, whatever bad habits you have, etc. I think it was even referenced in Gone Girl, like, be the cool girl, be the cool guy until like, and then when they fall for you, you can show them who you really are. And I feel like games like that are so interesting because everybody plays them to a certain level, and then it can really cause a relationship to fall apart. And when it's explored in a book, how dangerous that can be,
Mhm.
or how, you know, it can just escalate to like a very intense scenario, I just find it completely fascinating.
Yes. Yeah.
Like, I was burnt out on domestic suspense for the longest time until I read The Woman Inside. And then I was like, okay, this is why, like, when there's that domestic aspect with like a psychological thriller, this is like, this is my drug.
Yeah. Well, I just also want to say we definitely didn't invite you on the show to gas us up and talk about The Woman Inside, but it's really wonderful to hear your take on that because, you know, one of the things that we really were talking about when we were thinking up the book was how two people can be in a relationship for so long and not communicate, and how that lack of communication can like erode into something like so deadly, you know, like and
Mhm.
also kind of the double speak, you know, one person is saying one thing and the other person is hearing it differently, and like the disastrous results that can happen with that. So I'm glad that we succeeded for you reading that, you know, that was gratifying because definitely for me writing it, I had personal anger behind it about a situation in my life and I couldn't enact, you know, the anger without, you know,
Mhm.
committing multiple crimes. So I did it on the page and Greg was my
Well,
accomplice.
I mean, just for the record, I would have busted both of you out of jail if it had gone down differently. So that offer's still on the table. I don't want to limit us, but you know, so far so good.
Well, it's just like fascinating for me the relationships that you feature in your
Mhm.
books with imposter syndrome, and how they're all different, and like even like the rule of three, like there were so many different relationships going on in that,
Hmm.
and it was just like one like wallop after another, and like I'm
Yeah.
entertained, but I'm also feeling sorry for characters, and I'm like, oh my God, I could not imagine going through that. And I think that's what I, you know, not to gas you up, I'm this is not a paid sponsorship, but that's why I love your story so much, because I'm not just turning the pages to find out what happens next. It's really making me think what I would do in that situation, how I would react, and you can tell that there's like passion in those stories and those characters.
Hmm.
And like I will never forget Paul and Rebecca and Sheila,
Thank
obviously.
you.
Sheila's my girl. Sheila's like Gone Girl's Amy's like cooler older sister.
Wow.
Like, she's like, I taught you everything you know. Sit down.
Wow. That is,
I just loved Sheila's my girl. Sheila's my
Liz, I say
girl.
we just hang it up now and rest on our laurels. I mean, it's not, well, I don't think we could write
I
for
know.
the rest of our lives and never get as beautiful of a compliment as that. So,
Right.
well done.
Right. Or instead of hang it up, write an entire book about Sheila's
Or
story.
just do that.
You know, every time
Yeah,
we talk to you, Gare, I'm like, this is a character who clearly needed more page,
yeah,
space, and her
I don't
backstory we didn't get to go into that
right.
much. But
I mean, I would read it, but I think the thing that's really interesting about a character like Sheila is like the curiosity of if she like is this a result from something in like her backstory, or like is this just who she is? Like
mhm.
did she just like have
Mhm.
enough? I've been in like I've been in like a few situations that Sheila was in, and like eventually like I was like, oh my god, like this is how I could react, but I'll just read the woman inside again instead of getting my tart.
Amazing. Have there been in your recent reading, kind of adventures? Have there been any particularly like memorable characters that have jumped up? Anyone vivid? Anyone you didn't see coming, weren't anticipating, who really like knocked your socks off in that way?
There was what what have you done by Shari
Ah, okay,
Lapina.
yep. I keep
Mm.
hearing about that one.
Every single
Okay,
character.
wow,
Wow.
Every single character in that book knocked my
okay,
socks off.
Mm.
very memorable.
I just felt like the chapters were short and there were so many characters and you didn't spend a ton of time
Yep.
with them, but they all kind of had their own thing going on where you were like frustrated with them, but you sympathized
Mhm.
with them. And I just like really, really loved the ending to it.
Mm.
And my heart is still broken for Pamela Schumacher from Bright Young Women
Oh
Mm.
yeah, wow.
and Tina
Hmm.
Cannon. Those are two characters that I know that the book is loosely based off,
Yeah,
Ted Bundy.
Mhm.
But those were like two characters that I was like, even though I know these actual characters do not
right.
exist, it was just like my heart was like
Yeah,
broken reading that one because I feel like I don't know, sometimes you like read a book and you're like, oh, okay, like I kind of know what that character's life is going to be like now that the book is over.
Mhm.
And with that one, I was just like, they're never going to be
right,
okay or happy or
right,
normal,
Mhm.
right,
Mhm.
So that was one that just because of those characters, well, I mean, everything about that book is
right.
incredible, but um, those characters really stuck with me for a long time.
Yeah. I had that experience too. Well, I'm curious. First of all, I just want to say you have said twice that you don't have a great memory, but you remember character
Mhm.
names so incredibly. I mean, I can barely keep track of the characters we're
Right.
writing, and you just listed like three characters from books that like didn't come out last week. So I just want to say I don't think your memory is as bad as you think
Right.
it is, but
Well, so the thing is Jar of Hearts and The Woman Inside are books that I've read openly multiple times. Like that is like those are like my go-tos. Um, I love to read The Woman Inside around
Mhm.
Halloween. It's like I take 3 days off from work and I binge it and I watch all the movies. It's like my favorite. But those are books that I've read multiple times, and they're also characters that I they did things that I wasn't really
Yeah.
expecting. Um, Sheila was a completely different character than I was expecting when I first met her on the page versus who she was by the end
Right.
of the book.
mm,
Same thing with Geo and Jar of Hearts. And the thing is as much as I love the Shari
Mhm.
Lapina book, what have you done? I can't remember a single character's name in it.
mm,
And I read it a couple
Okay.
weeks ago, but I love the
Right.
book.
mm,
And I remember the
Right.
ending. But it's like weird things like that, like there's something that's got to really, I guess, be stuck in my mind a couple
Right.
of times,
That makes sense.
you know.
Right.
But I've written about Bright Young Women so many times at this point that I remember a lot of the characters' names.
Right.
But but yeah, I mean, I think if a character like does something that I am completely not expecting, or their personality really shifts
Mhm.
throughout a book, that really sticks with me for
Mm.
some reason.
What makes for a good, like a satisfying ending for you? Because I've heard you mention ending a few times, and I love that because people usually focus on a strong beginning, but don't talk about endings as much.
I think I like to be shocked, or I like to be sad.
Hmm.
So I feel like with a good ending, it, there's there's so many things that people can do with the ending to a book that is like satisfying to their reader, but is it realistic? So the toxic relationship of Nick and Amy and Gone Girl, like no one else could really replicate that.
Mhm.
Um, the unreliable narrator of Rachel and Girl on the Train and the ending to that book, people, have kind of done a similar trope with the drug and alcohol addiction as, creating an unreliable narrator, but Rachel will stick with me for a long time because that was one of the first ones that I read.
Mhm.
Um, but I also love a bleak ending because I feel as though it's probably The War of the Roses is my favorite movie in the entire world. I talk about that all the time. Um, but that was like one of my first experiences where like Hollywood didn't give a happy ending just to have a happy ending.
Mhm.
Um, and that's when you're reading a thriller and people are getting murdered and people are doing horrible things to each other and there's these twists and turns and you find out that the people that you trusted are people that you shouldn't have trusted. I feel like a lot of those stories don't end in the most like happy ways.
Mhm.
Um, that's what I respect about Karen Slaughter. We live in a really terrifying
Yeah.
country. So when you find that five teenage girls have gone missing and they think that they're all related, you're not going to find them in a cabin just deciding that they decided that they were going to, go on spring break with their boyfriends. Like horrible things happen to people all the time, and I think that if it's realistic and you allow the ugliness that happens in the world to be in your story, it really hits harder than being, like, oh, they're all alive and everyone's happy, and because that's not always how life
Right.
works.
Mhm.
Absolutely.
Bleak Billings.
Are there any tropes of late that you found either refreshing or that you're really enjoying leaning into?
I feel like I've been reading so many different things that I'm not finding a lot of tropes that are like really repeating, which I think is good for me
Yeah.
as a reader. Um, the unreliable narrator that I mentioned earlier, like with like drug and alcohol addiction, that kind of got a little
Yeah.
like too much for me. It was happening too much. The husband going
Mhm.
missing, that you just find out he's like a shady businessman and his like wife
Yeah.
didn't know it. That got a little repetitive. So I haven't found any tropes that are repeating, but I will always stick with like a missing person, um, podcast elements
Mhm.
in a thriller I'm
Okay.
obsessed with. um, I really like, I can't think of the name. Megan Collins wrote a book recently, that featured siblings.
Yes. Oh yeah, I love that book. I come up with the name of it.
I can see the
It's
cover,
so
but
good.
not the.
Yeah, it's so good. It's so good. The sibling relationship, I feel like, isn't explored a lot in a thriller, and I find that to be really
Yeah.
creepy because these are people that you grew up with, right? Like these are like the people that know, like, if you skip brushing your teeth at night every now and then, or like how often you really do your
Yeah.
laundry. So like when there's a sibling aspect, I find it to be really interesting. Geneva Rose just did it with Home is Where the
Right.
Bodies Are.
Yes.
Samantha Downing
Oh
has
yeah.
done it,
Oh yeah.
but I
Oh,
find,
yeah.
yeah, like the sibling rivalry or like the sibling relationships when those are explored, I feel like it's like very
I do.
fascinating.
Yeah.
Well, two things. It's thicker than water. Is that
Oh, yes.
yes? So that's the Megan Collins
Yes.
title, and I'm glad to make your day, Gare, because our next book is all about siblings. It's a brother and sister, so this makes me very happy.
I am so excited for that. I already told Greg who I imagine
Mhm.
on the cover. Like the minute the cover came out, I was like, by
Mhm.
the way,
Yeah, you got some comments.
this is who I'm getting. So, no, I am so excited. I am so excited for that. Because the thing is I really liked it with Samantha Downing's book that he
Mhm.
Yeah.
started it.
Yeah, that was
Oh,
great.
the road
And then it
trip
was
book
like,
is fantastic. There's so much
yeah,
good stuff
Mhm.
in there.
yeah. And it was so
Yeah.
different too.
Mhm.
So I really enjoyed it. And then it was a few years before Thicker Than Water by
Mhm.
Megan Collins came out. And then it was a couple more years before Geneva
Right.
Roses came out.
Mhm.
And so I just was like, this is kind of one of those tropes that I would gobble up if more people were exploring it. So I'm really
Yeah.
excited for that.
And I'm surprised more people don't because, obviously the domestic trope in marriage has been done a lot and it's great and it's kind of rife with psychological components, but I think family even more
Yeah.
so. Like you just said, people who kind of know you in a very, specific, intimate way, and then also all of the
Yeah.
kind of like resentments and competition and family secrets. And I mean, siblings, I think, watch now, next year, there'll be like 20 books about siblings and thrillers.
Right. It's gonna be like
I was
all
going
of
to say, I
it.
mean, it's amazing that we don't have a whole subgenre of thrillers that are basically like family Thanksgiving dinner locked room murder mysteries, right? It's all
Right.
there.
But yeah, well, the thing that I find fascinating is that, like, kind of like what I mentioned earlier, where like people play games with each other when they're in a relationship, like when it starts off, or maybe they play games after. And it's like that's the person that you chose to have in your life. That's the person you chose to spend your
Right.
life with. But like a sibling, you don't have a choice in the
Nope.
matter.
Mhm.
So like that's like somebody that like you can play games with and have a toxic relationship with, but you're kind of stuck with for majority of your adult or your young
Right.
adult life.
Mhm.
So that's why I find it like really
Yeah.
fascinating.
Yes. Yeah. And
Yeah, so I'm really excited for this.
your parents in a very particular way, like you and your siblings or sibling are the only people who know the kind of specific crazy of your parents or the specific fill in the blank. So
Yeah.
it's, for whatever tension there is or resentments or love, you also have this kind of like shared
Mhm.
knowledge, even though people can have very different experiences within the same home.
Right.
I just think, to unpack and we tried to do that, like what siblings like kind of like the shorthand they have
Mhm.
and
Oh my
the
God.
way in which they can like push buttons that like no one else
Yeah.
can. The manipulation
Oh yeah.
possibilities,
And then
it's endless.
and then also the alliances around the resentments, because it's like you can have certain things where siblings sort of are pitted against one another, but then there can be other things where they team up where the resentment against like one of the
Mhm.
parents is stronger than the individual ones with the sibling. So there's all kinds of ways you can shuffle that. Yeah, yeah,
Configurations.
yeah. Mm.
Yeah. I think that's like so fascinating. I can't wait to read your book, but also like see other people. Maybe there's just a lot of authors that are single
Might
children
be.
That's true.
It,
and
it
have
would explain
siblings.
a
Yeah.
certain amount.
Yeah. I couldn't do it. I could write about toxic relationships until like my fingertips fall off, but I couldn't write about sibling relationships.
Well, Gare, with our last few minutes, because there was a comment like kind of made earlier about maybe it was before we started recording about putting something in a book.
Mm.
But do you write? Do you identify as a writer? Do you have aspirations to write?
I do have aspirations to write. Um, I have an idea for a story that I have been thinking about for probably 2 years
Mm,
now. Um, it it's kind of based on um, a little bit of like the War of the
Mm.
Roses and what that would be like in a queer
Mm.
relationship
mm,
from beginning to ending. Because I find that what I like about that story is if you if you cut it into pieces, you have almost a romance, a drama, and then a thriller. But I do like to, I'm thinking of trying to write it, and I've been like thinking about these characters for a really long time and coming up with things that I think would be really good in like the fun toxic aspect of the relationship. But that's actually something that I do have imposter syndrome with is um, I've written a prologue, and I am very thankful to Ashley Winstead who read it and told me she loved it.
Amazing.
And that's all I've written. And I have like key scenes and I have notes and I have flashcards everywhere. And that's like something that I've dealt with imposter syndrome because I'm like, when do you consider yourself a writer? Is it like when you're writing, when you finish something, when it sells, when it publishes? So that's kind of like why I don't usually talk about that very often because I'm like, I don't want to say like I'm going to write a book and then, 10 years later it's still not, out or finished or anything like that. But yeah, I have sometimes these ideas just pop in my head and I think that would be such a good story, but it's just, getting it from up here to a 300 to 400 page book. That's kind of a
Well,
time
well, I
consuming
realized it
part.
was a rhetorical question that you just asked about when you realize that you're an actual writer. And once we figure it out, we'll let you know.
Okay.
So it gets shored up for the two of us as well. So
Right.
we'll give you the heads up. But we would love to read. I mean, as fans of yours, as fans of War of the Roses, as the source material, we would absolutely be overjoyed to read that book. So
Yes.
Well, thank you.
And if
You guys will be the first ones to get it.
oh, good.
we'll be honored.
And if a story is is talking to you for 2 years, it wants to be told. I mean, we all kind of live with this, the stories that just like ingrain themselves in our head. And I think the only way to get rid of those is to get them on the page.
Yeah.
So do it.
I've told my friends like a few ideas for like different scenes, and I'm like, do you think that they're gonna have me committed like when this book comes out?
Well, if there's any market for things that might seem psychologically questionable, this is it. So
Yeah.
I'd find a better medium.
Gare, we adore you. Thank you so much.
I love you guys
for this time and for all of your beautiful, encouraging words for about our book. But really, we just love to hear what makes you tick and what you love to read.
Yeah.
You have so many good things to say about great books, and you're such a supporter of authors. So we're so grateful. How can people find you? We want to have people who don't know about you and follow you and see all your amazing reviews and casting.
Yeah, I'm right on Instagram. That's my main source of social media, and it's at Gare Indeed Reads. So that's where you can find me.
Awesome.
Amazing.
Well, thanks again.
All right. Well, thank you so much, guys. I had so much fun, and
us too.
Hopefully we'll do it again soon.
For sure.
We'll have to, for sure. Thank you for being on, Gare.
No problem.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Imposter Hour with Liz and Greg is created by us, Elizabeth Keenan and Greg Lawrence. The show is produced and edited by Kate Herget, creator of the Book Wild Podcast Collective. Our original theme music is composed by Scott Leeds, and Steve Luoma designed our logo. Thanks all for listening.
And you can find us on Instagram at Imposter Hour Podcast and online at imposterhour.com. Until next time.